Good afternoon, folks. Chief Meteorologist Nick Lilly here with a look at your tropical update for October 9th of 2018. We've got a lot going on. A lot of it circled around what's happening with Michael out here out into the Gulf of Mexico. This thing continues to kind of drift off to the north, and for a while it was actually moving to the north-northwest. It's flipped back to the north at about 12 miles an hour, wind at 110. This is as of the 1 o'clock advisory from the Hurricane Center, about 335 miles off to the south of Panama City. You can see that it's wrapping itself up pretty good. Most of the convection with this is on the north side of the storm and on the east side, though I will say, surprisingly enough, it's got a pretty decent western side to it. A lot of times with these tropical systems that we tend to get out of the Central American gyre, they don't necessarily, historically speaking, get very strong, and usually they're pretty lopsided. And yeah, sure, you can make the argument that what's happening on the east side of the storm is a whole lot more than what's happening on the west, but usually these things are so lopsided that on the west side it's almost dry. You guys remember Nate and Alberto that moved through here. I mean, even Gordon to some sense, no, not from the Central American gyre. I mean, the west side was just basically dry. On this side, though, or in this storm, I should say, the west side still actually has some convection to it. But that's not it for what's happening out into the tropics. Of course, yeah, we've got Michael. We ran this thing back about 48 hours, and you can see it drifting to the north for a while, moving off to the north-northwest before flipping back to the north. The thing that really helped us out, you see all this thunderstorm activity out here? The ridge of high pressure, the Bermuda High that's out here, got weakened a little bit by some of this thunderstorm activity, the convection that's out here. The weakened side of this ridge is allowing Michael, as it lifts to the north, to actually move to the northeast eventually and away from us. We're also aided by a cold front that's back there. But that's not the only game in town. We still have Leslie. Yes, we still have Leslie out here floating around. And actually, newly minted Nadine. We're going to start out with Leslie, which is going to drift off to the south and eventually peel back around to the east. By the way, that's Portugal and Spain. Thought is, right now at 65 miles an hour, that it's going to strengthen back to a Category 1 as we head through the next couple of days back to hurricane status. So even though it's moving to the south-southeast right now at about 10 to 15 miles an hour, that's going to curlicue its way back around to the east and may eventually kind of bother Portugal and Spain and maybe even northern sections of Africa. Then down off to the south, well, it looks like we lost maybe some satellite data in here. That's not very good. We've got Tropical Storm Nadine. The good news with Nadine, even though it has wind at 40 and it's gusting to 50, about 480 miles off the southernmost Cabo Verde island, the thought is with this, it's going to drift off to the northwest and eventually get out of the warmer waters, get into a less favorable environment, and basically fall apart back into a tropical depression and then into basically nothingness. This one's going to have to be watched, as it may. I don't think it's going to live quite the lengthy life that Leslie has lived, for a little bit of alliteration. But Nadine may float around out here for a little while, the remnants of it, and it may be something we've got to keep an eye on for the better part of the next about week, roughly, week and a half. But I know all eyes are on Michael right now. Here's your forecast track with Michael. Slated to be a Category 3 by later this evening and hold Category 3 status until landfall somewhere between about Fort Walton Beach, past Panama City, and Carabel, I think, is the other further eastern edge of Florida. And again, 335 miles off to the south of Panama City. Interesting thing about Michael, you know, I'd like to talk about isotherms and heat content and everything. A lot of people, oh, this always the sea surface temperatures that you hear about. Usually it has to do with more than that. In Michael's case, it didn't really matter. Here's the historical track of Michael here, which, I mean, you know, you look at this, it went north, and it went off to the east, and it went back to the north, and it was going northeast, and it went north. I mean, it's kind of meandered its way through the straits of between Mexico and Cuba. But you've got plenty of warm water out here on the surface. See all the oranges and reds? Well, you look underneath the surface, and usually we want to look at the isotherm. And I am blown away. Michael's plopped right on top of, right now, some not as deep warm water. Again, that 26-degree isotherm is just how deep is it? Warm water, 26 degrees or warmer. It's pretty shallow. I mean, we're talking 25 meters. That's not a lot when you're talking about a tropical system and just how much rain they produce. The rain falls, it cools the water, that cool water sinks because water, a lot like air, hot air rises, cold air sinks. Same thing with water, cold water sinks and hot water rises. So the thought is, well, if you're raining it out and you're cooling the ocean water and then that cooler water sinks, well, what's it getting replaced with? Well, not as much warm water in this area as maybe just off to the west. So it's really surprising that we saw a decent amount of strengthening overnight last night and early this morning when it was plopped right there, right on top of almost, you could argue, the most shallow warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, all the strengthening it did to the south of that, okay, sure, well, I'll buy that every day of the week. As we look at the heat content, the sea height anomaly, yeah, we had plenty of it. And the only reason, by the way, that you see some lighter shades down here now is because Michael is just there raining and raining and raining and cooling things down. But yeah, there's a little blue areas plopped right on top of. The idea is the reason it's going to keep, well, strengthen to Category 3 and keep that status is because it's riding on top of warmer than normal water as it continues off to the north and northeast and away from us, thank goodness, in South Mississippi. There's still a chance we have to deal with tropical storm force wind, and even in South Mississippi today we're dealing with gusty wind. I wouldn't call it tropical storm force, but it is enough where if you're walking around outside, it'll, you know, blow your hair, not that I have that problem, blow your hair around a little bit. But it's the folks to our east that are really in to be dealing with the actual wind from this thing. A 97% chance that you deal with tropical storm force wind in Destin, 98 in Tallahassee. It does peel off pretty quickly as you head off to the west, but it holds pretty good as you head to the east. Savannah, looking at almost a 50-50 shot of dealing with tropical storm force wind from Michael. That's a pretty decent chance given just how far away they're going to be from the center. 1% chance in Mobile, they deal with hurricane force wind, but a much greater chance as you head through Destin and toward Tallahassee. And if we had a little marker for Panama City, my guess would be it would be up around 70 to 80% that they deal with hurricane force wind from this. They already have evacuations going along the Florida coast. I've heard reports of traffic along I-10 and Highway 98 and a handful of the other county roads and county highways through the Florida Panhandle that are just backed up for miles and miles and miles as people try and get away from this storm. If you are watching this for whatever reason in Florida, thank you for checking us out. But if you are living along the coast or within maybe 50 miles of the coast and you can leave, and I know people can't always leave, I get that. But if you can leave, I would. And people in South Mississippi will tell you this if you ask any of them that lived through Katrina or, heaven forbid, Camille as well. That if you have the opportunity to leave, just go. There's nothing that you're going to want to live through being around with this thing as it plows through the area. Here's the most likely arrival time of those tropical storm force wind we were talking about. Wednesday at 8 a.m. For most of the Florida Panhandle. Maybe even as early as 2 a.m. for maybe just right along the coast near Panama City. Wednesday at 8 p.m. For the folks in parts of Georgia and even into parts of South Carolina as well. So that's a look at your tropical update, trying to go through things on Matthew. The good news is, at least for folks in South Mississippi, it's not necessarily headed our direction. So again, tropical update for October 9th of 2018.